o'clock on the dot. It's happy hour and time for our, I think, third art law talk, which we started a month or two ago to enable us to have conversations about art and law and all sorts of fun stuff. My name is Martha Rands, and I'm the Director of Programs at the Pacific Legal Education and Outreach Society, and we run a pro bono clinic for low-income artists called the Artist Legal Outreach. Among other things, we have a clinic as well as we do these things called conversations about copyright, and a whole series of podcasts which are up on our SoundCloud called Yours, Mine, and Ours, and just a plethora of other possibilities. Today, we are going to be talking about artist estates and estate planning for artists. And I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that to acknowledge that we are conducting today's event on the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we thank them for their forbearance. And we will be, also we're joined today by someone who's closed captioning for anyone who needs it. And also pointing out at the bottom of the screen, there's an icon Q&A. That is the place to put your questions. The way that we're going to work today is we're probably going to do it more conversation style. I will moderate the questions and put them to our guest. Our guest this afternoon, is a great friend of the arts, a patron, a collector, a lawyer, and someone with a very unique expertise, particularly with artist estates and estate planning with a number of Canadian artists. And I don't know if it's just Canadian artists, but certainly Canadian artists. And so every once in a while, we get asked questions because there are some very specific things about artist estates. And Denis Walz is our guy on that file in this part of the world. Not the only guy, but he's one of only a few people who's really dedicated a lot of his time and energy, not just to artists, but also to the question of estates. So Denis, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy time to talk to us a bit about artist estates. Anything you want to add about yourself to tell the peoples?
No, I think you've basically, that sums it up. That's all.
Covered it all.
Yeah.
Okay. So the reason that we're doing this today is primarily because what's been happening as a result of COVID is that some people are thinking about their estates. I mean, there is a certain reality for some of us that it might be time to get a will, to think about what to do with all that stuff. And within that is artwork, and also artists who have not only accumulated a significant amount of artwork of their own and also others who are also wondering what to do, wanting to either update their wills or thinking about it. So Denis, where do you start when you're working with an artist to deal with their estates?
Well, I mean, you start with artists much like any other person, but first of all, to get an overview of what their estate is, what it comprises. and whether that's, real estate, financial assets, and then art. I mean, and art and the artist's intellectual property rights and the artist's legacy. So those are the things that are very peculiar and particular for an artist. So they generally have assets like every other ordinary person, like ordinary folk, but they also have this, they often will have a body of work that they may have created during their lifetime, and it may be physical objects, or if they're a performing artist, such as a choreographer or composer, it may be the intellectual rights into the works that they've created. And they have to put their mind towards what do they want to happen with that work after after their demise, and how best do they want to ensure that their goals are reached. So you start out finding out A, what their assets are, and then B, what their circumstances are like everyone else. Do they have a spouse? Do they have children? Because generally I find artists, like anyone else, they have families, they have people that they probably want to benefit financially from their estate or feel an obligation to support. And then it's determining who are the best people really to be put in place to manage the assets, particularly the artistic assets that are, I guess I'll call them the intangible assets, that it's unclear what the value, for a lot of states, it's unclear what the value of that will be, and it's also unclear for how long the value of that will continue. I mean, often the situation I find is there's, people may have, they have a spouse, they have children, and like any other, say the standard estate plan, people are naming their spouse or their more responsible children to be their executors. And that may be fine to deal with their assets, such as their real estate or their financial assets, but perhaps their spouse or their child isn't familiar or doesn't really have the understanding of the art world to potentially deal with the artistic assets. And so I think often people, and so I think that's sort of what it comes down to. I guess to answer the question, I basically come down to what are the assets, who do they want to benefit, and then start working with how are the best ways to achieve the goals of what they want to achieve.
So let's say that I'm a painter and I have a body of work that we want to sort out. Should I appoint somebody to be my executor just to do that? What are the circumstances in which one would do that?
Possibly. It's a matter of looking at the skill set of the people that you appoint. Like a standard executor in a very basic standard estate, someone may die and have some real estate assets that have to be dealt with. Maybe there has to be a sale, maybe there has to be some debts paid off, a mortgage paid off, there has to be some cash that's liquidated, maybe there's savings accounts, TFSAs, things like that. And that can generally get wound up on a fairly basic estate. That can all be dealt with within, approximately a year. Sometimes, depending on the complexity, may go on, longer than that. With the artist estate, though, particularly if they have a large body of work, physical works, it's probably something that's going to be ongoing for much longer than a couple of years. It may go on for many, many years. I mean, my understanding is I think the Milne estate still has paintings from David Milne. Because if you've had a large body of work, it's very unlikely you'll be able to just dispose of it all at once. You probably cannot put it into the market all at once. Well, you can't put it onto the market all at once. You'll destroy the market price. And unless there's some body that's willing to accept the entire work, somehow you're going to have this work is going to have to be held. And that portion of the estate will probably be an ongoing, it's going to be an ongoing entity in its way for many years. And the person appointed to manage that, you would probably want it to be somebody who's got some knowledge or some experience in dealing with the art world. So they would know how to deal with galleries, perhaps how to deal with curators, how to deal with art historians. So they're working to keep the artist's legacy alive, to keep your knowledge alive, to monitor where works are being placed. So, and it may be two executors still. So you may choose somebody who just deals with your regular assets and then choose a separate artistic executor who's going to deal with your artistic work. And that's not just the physical work, it'd also be the copyright. We've got to remember that the copyright, right now today, it will last for 50 years beyond the life of a Canadian artist, beginning at the last day of the year and the year in which the artist dies, and likely as soon as the USMCA is ratified will be extended to 70 years. So that's a long period of time. So you probably want to build in somebody, and even with the physical works that may have been the executives responsible for placing them or selling them or donating them to the right institutions, you will have ongoing somebody who has to make decisions, copyright decisions to include the works into publications, has to grant the rights, maybe a decision of whether there can be copies made of the work, whether you want copies made of the work at all. I mean, that would probably, and it probably will be a role that will go arguably for 50 years, 70 years. So you'd probably want to build in someone who's got experience in the art world, and building into that the right for that person then eventually to appoint their successor, because they're likely not.
So we all know, you're referencing someone like Milne or Jack Shadbolt or whoever, where there's been critical acclaim, there's an established history with the gallery, there's sales. Yeah. What about, there's a lot of artists who may or may not have really sold their work. Yeah. What do they do?
Well, that's always a difficult question. I mean, there is no doubt that if an artist has not achieved some sort of market recognition or public recognition during their life, it's much more difficult after their death for them to ever achieve that. That's just sort of the reality. I've done a couple of courses with the Institute of Artists' Estates, which is an organization based out of Berlin, which manages artists' estates. And I think if you can look at it, that's just sort of a reality one has to accept, that if an artist passes away before they have before they've established a market presence, they're going to have to make a decision and they have a large body of work, they're going to have to make a decision of who do they want to give that work to, how is that work going to be kept, how's it going to be maintained, and who do they trust to make the decision as to what to do with the work? I mean, it's a very hard situation. I know of an estate recently where there's a lot of work. It's really wonderful work, but the artist, for the artist's own sort of personality, did not want to be that connected with the art market, and had some success in the art market about 20 years ago in sales, but had one exhibition where everything sold out, and then there was a second exhibition a year later and only about 30 or a third of the work sold, and it made him he began very much to second judge himself, and he decided he wanted to pull completely out of the art market. And the gallery was representing him at that time. I know the dealer wanted to continue to represent this artist, but this artist refused. So now we have a situation where there's a lot of great paintings. There's definitely a reputation of this artist, but whether the estate is going to be able to afford to keep those, or it's a tough question.
Yeah, I know that was also an issue with one BC-based sculptor, where he left a huge amount of work to his wife, and his wife still living, and she was able to live in the family home.
Right.
And there were works that had basically been installed in their garden, kind of thing. Then there were works in the garage, and she became, she's quite old now. She's in her 80s. And there was also this effort to, when he died, to try to have some kind of legacy left for the Sculptors Society. And, but it was rather more than his wife, who had been his executor, could handle.
Yes.
And then she became infirm, and she had a committee appointed. And and there was a real question about which works then, because he left like, I can't remember the name of the artist. It's not coming to me.
Yeah, I know the name. I know the exact artist you're referring
Yeah,
to. Well, you
yeah,
just gave me really wonderful sort of modernist sculptures. And Jeff
yeah,
Wall did a whole series photographing.
yeah,
His name will come, but yes,
yeah.
yeah.
It's one of the, he's one of the artists that, there's a whole series of books about BC artists that are perhaps lesser known in some respects. And it was quite a, it's quite a complicated matter, but I remember having to look at these lists of artworks and assessing which ones really could be sold so that his wife would have been taken care of. And, you know, and again, the works that had the value that were not necessarily they were the ones that the Sculptors Society also wanted to hold on to as a legacy that they would hold of his work. It gets quite complicated.
Yes.
And in a way, you know, it's like, these are the kinds of things that I think artists need to be thinking about in life. Like, who am I leaving with what? And how realistic is it to expect my spouse to necessarily have the capacity always to deal with this stuff?
Well, yes. I mean, there's also a case in with the Betty Goodwin estate in Montreal where she left her estate to her husband. She and her husband had no children. Very simple will, so everything just passed on her death to him. She died around 2008. He died, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago. But after she died, he remarried. And I think my understanding, is that he remarried to someone that she was not particularly fond of. And then he subsequently died and left everything to this person. And I mean, I don't know who the name of this person is, but I mean, is that the artist has to think through, and maybe it's someone who will still manage the estate very well because they understand that it's in their their own financial best interest to make sure that the legacy of the artist continues and that the work is placed and that the reputation and that the dialogue of the artist is kept up with curators and art historians and younger artists so that people remember them, so it doesn't sort of fade away. But I think it's people I've talked to have thought it's probably not what this artist would have wanted. You know, if she was to make the choice, she wouldn't have said, this is the person I want to be managing my work. So I think artists have to think it through like that. It may be simple to say, yes, I want to appoint my spouse, and maybe your spouse at this time seems like they're the person that could manage it appropriately, but maybe you want to build in that it's you appoint your spouse during your spouse's lifetime and during your spouse's capacity to do this, and in the event that your spouse becomes incapacitated. So it's like a life interest to manage the estate, and upon your spouse's passing, that you've already nominated someone else, or the mechanism by which the successor is appointed.
Right.
That's right.
And then there's also the reality that many spouses are not involved in the art world at all. Yes. So you leave them with this. In one situation that I was involved in, literally a studio full of stuff, and an individual who was really at a loss as to how to approach it, because again, it was a lesser known individual, someone who had some modicum of success, but for themselves, but not necessarily so much that all of the drawing. I mean, there were hundreds of pieces, right. and it was they were of limited interest, but she had no idea where to start in terms of finding curators, in terms of speaking to institutions, and especially having just lost her spouse. Right. And in that case, she was the second spouse. Right. So there were children from the first marriage. And so there was also a certain amount of angst as a result of the passing of this
What the artist can also do, I mean, and things that an artist I think also should be doing at the same time in conjunction with creating their will, is maybe setting out, in a separate document called a letter of wishes, or to assist their executor. So it could be a situation where maybe they still want to appoint their spouse as the executor because they feel that's the person, their spouse or their child or a good friend, but they want to leave a letter of instructions to really assist their executor in what to do, of saying, okay, this is the person, these are the people you should contact to assist you with, providing them with names of their gallerists or people involved in the art world, people that then, and then you trust that your spouse, although your executor, your appointed executor may not be actively involved in the art world, that they have enough common good sense to go and follow your directions and seek out the best advice and assistance to sort of, implement your wishes. I mean, a thing also that should be included in that is artists really should put their minds to. I mean, there's things that they should be doing in advance. I mean, keeping as much of an inventory of their estate as they can, like of their works. I think it's always good to keep, as much as you can, a list of what you've done. If you know where it exists, a list of where it exists. Anytime, any works that are on consignment with a gallery, definitely, everyone I just say, get a simple acknowledgement from the gallery that you've delivered these works to them, because it helps whoever the executor is at the time to try to track down where the works are, right? Because many artists, we're talking right now just about visual artists, they're dealing with several different galleries, and they might have work in places, in several different cities. And to make life for your executor easily, you want to sort of let them know who to approach or where to go to and where to reach out to find out what works have been sold and what works haven't been sold, what's still out there, and make a decision whether they bring the work all back into the estate. Often that's what happens while the estate decides how to move forward. Also, an artist should really express their wishes in regard to copies. I mean, whether they want, sculptures, it's a big thing, whether they want further castings, posthumous castings done of the work, whether they want prints to be made of the work. I mean, all of that, it's really should be expressed. It helps your executor decide how to fulfill what the artist's wishes were.
Right. I think it's probably important also to mention to people that we will be posting links to the Joan Mitchell Foundation Guide to Estate Planning that they put together a little over a year ago with the Massachusetts Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, or maybe it was 2 years ago. And also, at one point, Carfax, Ontario, had a guide to estate planning. I don't know if it's been updated, but that was a Canadian guide that was available through Carfax, Ontario. And I think in there, I know in the Joan Mitchell Foundation one, they have a workbook with a list of questions. And they also have a workbook in there for lawyers, so for attorneys. And I think it's important to note for anyone out there listening to this, that not all lawyers necessarily will appreciate some of the particularities that arise when you're dealing with an artist's estate. So you might go to an individual or even get a will package from Self-Counsel Press or whatever, but that isn't necessary. That is not going to include the kinds of issues that we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. There's another part of this that is also really important, I think, which is the collections that artists have of artworks themselves.
Yeah.
And many artists are significant collectors of all kinds of art.
And they trade work, artists trade work amongst themselves.
Yeah. So I think it's, and this is an area where I have some personal experience with what happens when you don't consider what to do with things before you go. And it is one of those areas where if you are dealing with an artist who has a significant collection, they need to consider also what to do with that collection. Are they going to make donations of those artworks to galleries, to institutions? If they're collecting works where there's significant market interest, how are they going to deal with that? Are there artworks that, for example, maybe there's a family member or a close friend, and you know that somebody has coveted your Mifanwe McLeod piece of psychic piece. So, you know, I'm looking forward to that piece coming my way, Dennis. But, you know,
Martha, I can't believe you think that.
But I think it's really important that, you know, I encourage everybody I know with a collection
absolutely.
to,
and I think it's important
doing this in life.
And your own, I think there's two parts of that, yes, because an artist has to think of, they may have a body of their personal work they may want to leave. Often family members, close family members or close friends may really appreciate receiving a particular work. I think it can help in having disputes or fights later on if the artist can, you know, specify if, you know, specific works for specific family friends. I mean, that's not always the case, but it can help. Otherwise, I've seen some wills where it's specified that family members have choices, and then it leads to, you know, people, you know, some people choosing works that maybe are more valuable than other works, and leads to other disputes with the estates. And then, yeah, and the artists, a lot of artists have, very nice personal collections of their own, because they have managed through their lives often to have bartered and traded work with other artists. I mean, the Rauschenberg estate, I mean, they had, I know their first executive foundation, I mean, they had to make a decision because and they decided eventually in that case, because they just inherited everything. There was a certain amount of money went to his son, a certain amount of money went to his last lover, and then a huge amount, including Captiva and his rights and his bodies of work, all went to the foundation, the Rauschenberg Foundation. And the foundation eventually made the decision, and he had a very, you know, blue chip, wonderful, because he changed, you know, because of his era and a lot of the works he had. And they decided that the purpose of the foundation was to promote his legacy, and it was better just to document the works that he had. I think they did a publication of his collection, and then everything was auctioned through. It was Sotheby's or Christie's did a big auction, and they brought in, I think, like over $110 million, like extras, you know, a huge amount of money for it. So it's always a matter of thinking, when you're thinking of the artist's legacy, is what do you keep and what do you not keep? So their works, do you keep the other works that they've collected? Is that important to keep? I mean, and this, again, you're talking about like pretty large estates, if they're going to be keeping things like that are creating a foundation, that they're going to keep things, I mean, somehow to be displayed or loaned out and are part of this. So there's some sense that there'll be a museum named in honor of the artist, which is, you know, pretty remote. I think that's very few artists are at the level that there's so much money that should ever happen. It's cost so much, even just having in a foundation. And a lot of people talk about foundations, and it's a very big American model to set up a foundation. I know certain people think that the foundations are really just structures created by lawyers to generate a lot of fees for lawyers, because they're very costly and they're ongoing. And so you have to look at it, and it's also with the artists, it's often looking, again, it sort of feels like I'm dealing with visual artists a lot here, but there's the physical artworks they've created. There's also their archives. This would also apply to writers or to choreographers, composers. There's that portion of their letters, their archives, their diaries. What is done with that? I mean, archives are a very complicated thing, and they're a very complicated thing to find a place to take them, because they often comprise institutions. You want to find the right institution where to place it. I often, with the artists I work with, I often like to, as part of the estate plan, to think through where their connections are and to approach them during their lifetime to find an institution that is willing, or they've got a connection at that point with people in the institution, and the institution agrees during their lifetime that upon their death they're going to assume their archives, because archives themselves can take up a lot of space, right? I've seen archives that taking up boxes and boxes and boxes, and like everything, real estate takes space, and they keep the archives, and then eventually they scan stuff and have a proper archivist go through it and order things. And
yeah, and then there's questions about, some of us would like things to go into archives, and the archives are not necessarily interested in the work that is on offer. And I think that's why, when I say do things in life, it's going to be more beneficial both to your state, to your beneficiaries, to anybody that's left grieving or, dealing with the loss of someone, to have figured this out ahead of time.
Yes.
Because, there's just limited, as you say, archives are real estate. And the reality is that the archives are full. They're getting a lot more selective. And in fact, they're deaccessioning.
Yes. I mean, fortunately now, with digitization, a lot of the archives right now, they're also working through to digitize things, but that takes time. That takes time, and it takes people to physically go through boxes and digitize things, and then they can decide what is discarded that they don't physically have to keep. I think it's, for myself as a lawyer, I've certainly gotten into the paperless mode and digitizing and scanning things and eliminating. You're really reducing dramatically the amount of paper I have. And I think artists should do the same thing as much as possible, digitize things as they move along. And it's less space consuming.
Yes. So I'm going to move to questions now. There is a question. So, question is, rather than list specific works to particular family members and friends, what about assigning a trusted person to make these decisions based on the requests and situation at the time? Well,
you can do that. Of course, it can. Of course you can. I've seen other situations where it's like, okay, there's the group of people listed who will each be entitled to a work, and you leave it to your trustee to devise the mechanism by which they can each select a work. And is that like drawing straws? Is that it? Is that how you do? And then the first person draws it? And that's, yeah, you can do that. If I was a trustee, I would, if I was appointed as a trustee, I would sort of feel like I would want a little more direction if possible up front, to know what pieces I should be giving and to whom those should be going. It seems easier than having to deal with a situation where you have, say, two children who each want, the painting of Grandma Moses, right? And they both like covet it, and then you're in that horrible position of having to be the person that chooses, right? And slice it in half and give it to them.
Yeah, I think, this raises for me the, don't leave to other people what you really need to do yourself. There's a certain amount of avoidance around what is going to happen after we go. And we think everybody's going to be happy, or not, or everybody's going to be sad, but that everybody's going to get along. And it's simply not the case. The reality is that the loss of someone brings out the best in people and the absolute worst. Mm-hmm. And I think particularly where you're dealing with close family members, there will be fights over, who gets the real reapel, or who gets the thing that actually has value. Suddenly somebody's interested in the valuable piece because they find out there's value to it, even though they never liked it. And I think that people behave in ways that are quite remarkable in my experience. So I think the more information that you can deal with, and I also think it's really important that, say what you want to have done, because one cannot predict when one is going to go. My father, for example, you know, he had a significant contemporary Canadian art collection and had identified all of these artworks as being donated, would be donated, but he imagined himself living for a considerably longer period of time. And there would be this slow drip of artworks leaving his frame of reference. And indeed, he gifted some significant works over the years. But when he had 4 months from the diagnosis to his death to basically, all that really could happen was put sticky notes on the back of all of them and say, donate to the AGO or don't, you know, whatever. And it ended up being it could have been a real issue because the value of the artworks far exceeded what was in the estate. And so there could have been a significant capital gains tax assessment had there not been some way to, in effect, deal with these artworks. Though as I'm saying this, it occurred to me that actually I don't believe that very many of the artworks have actually been donated, which does raise the question about whether or not his spouse should now actually pay the capital gains tax. Oh, gee, that would be amusing, wouldn't it? Sorry, I digress. But, you know, I think also that, the point here is that there's tax implications. Mm-hmm. When you leave a lot of stuff that may have value, and that's also important to sort out before you go, because it's the value is deemed disposition at death. Yeah. So it's as if you sold it. So if you're sitting there with a Rembrandt and never told your kids.
Yeah. The date of death tax return that we all have due within 6 months of our death. CRA deems us to have disposed of all of our assets on the date of our death. So there are ways, so one can do estate planning with having donations built in advance, where you're going to get charitable receipts and cultural property receipts that will offset the gains and sort of reduce the taxes. That's often what we do. Sometimes with with that though, institutions all have lots of work. One really has to, a lot of times it's not a bad idea to approach the institutions you want to donate work to upon your death in advance and make sure that they're willing to accept them, because the institutions have space restrictions and they can't take everything. So
exactly.
This is the issue with visual artists who create things, is that they have this physical objects as well left. So there's the tax with that, and there's also then space constraints of where do you store things. And what's the cost of that, and who pays that? That's all. It's a very complicated issue. Yeah.
Right. And in fact, the storage costs over a significant period of time could take out, mm-hmm. could be more, mm-hmm. Particularly if there's a dispute and it draws and it lasts for a considerable period of time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Suddenly you're like paying all this money to store the stuff, and at the end of a year, you're looking at it and going, well, there's another little.
There have been certainly stories of that where eventually the artwork has ended up in the dumpsters. I've heard those stories too. Where
yes, well, that
family got tired of paying the storage and it all of them thrown out.
Yeah. So, are there any other questions? We're kind of light on questions today. Anyone else want to? You've got two people just sitting here at 20 to 6 going, well, now. Any questions?
Martha, your hourly rate's what, $800 an hour?
Oh, pshaw, Dennis. Stop.
Hmm.
I'm the bargain basement. You're the high-powered lawyer.
I guess this would, I then may have a question. How often do you, through the Artist Legal Outreach, do you get questions about wills and estates from?
Well, I would say that we don't get very many questions about estates, and we can't really take them in the clinic because it's a special, it's not really summary legal advice, first of all. Second of all, we don't have all of our lawyers are more on the copyright. They can do business structures, they can do a certain amount of employment, but really it's really getting into estate planning is out of their mix. And the questions we often get though are about just creating a will.
Yeah.
So, and mostly the reality is that most artists are effectively indigent. Their incomes are very low. They may have had a working life, but they're living on relatively little now. They just need a simple will. And for that, I always encourage people to access the Wills Clinic when it's available at Access Pro Bono. And I know that they're still, well, when I guess they are able to do more, I don't know, I suppose you could do it over a Zoom call. I don't know what they're doing in terms of the Wills clinics, but those issues do come up from time to time. It is one of the areas. We did apply for a law foundation applicate grant some years ago. We were working with the Performing Arts Lodge folks and trying to figure out a way to kind of develop some very specific materials and do some more outreach, but they were not interested in us pursuing that. So it's a fairly small part of what we do, but usually it comes up in the how do I write a basic will?
Right.
So the question, so there's now a clarification. Do I understand correctly that when you die, the artwork is considered sold?
Well, you're deemed to have disposed of it at fair market value. Yeah. So there's lots of. I'm actually not even certain how CRA is. There's a whole way by where there's there's a recognition. Really, with the IRS, it really started with things like the Warhol estate and that, where there's like millions, like hundreds of millions of dollars worth of, when he died, if you added up all the work, it would be like 700 million, or it was something like that. And the David Smith estate was another estate, huge amounts. And there is a recognition that you have to discount it because it's not possible to dispose of all of the work at one time without completely destroying the market. I mean, that's like the art markets, particularly when you're up at that level, it's a very strange thing. I mean, there are very few people who can afford to pay those prices, and the artists generally have created more work than it just kind of sells slowly. And a lot of the work has to be held for a long period of time. You can't put it on the market, or then there's too much supply and it'll just like depress the price. So there has been a recognition by the IRS, and I'm assuming CRA would come to that as well. And I'm sure there are situations where they have allowed sort of a discounting in a recognition that although one piece of work may go at a gallery for 10 to 20,000, if there's 200 of them left at the date of the artist's death, it's not like there's $2 million cash sell immedially that the estate could pay tax on. So
yeah. I mean, the reality is that, there's a number of different pieces here. One is that we're talking about when you die, you are deemed to have disposed of all of your assets. And so the value of those assets is calculated as of the date of death. And in the case of artwork, it's based on fair market value. Well, many artists, it's very difficult to determine what is fair market value because very little of their work is sold, or maybe their sales have been relatively negligible. And it's for that reason that we always say to artists, keep an inventory and keep track of what you sell and how much for, because that way we have a sense of what might be the value. In the case of people who have significant art collections, and even insignificant ones, if the artwork was, all purchased for less than $1,000, the CRA does not care.
Right.
They don't recognize artworks under $1,000. But what they do, but if you've been a collector, even a modest one, over many years, you probably have a few things that might have some value, and you may not know that. So it is possible, as is the case of my father. I mean, he knew the value, but they were in it because he was a college professor. He all of the whatever was in the estate, other than the artwork, was in a house, and that went to his spouse. There really wasn't much there, except there were 50 artworks, some of which individually were worth upwards of $100,000, which is still not a major collection in the grand scheme of things. But when we did the math, it was pretty obvious to me anyway, that if there had been an issue, if there had been an audit, for example, there could have been a significant issue. And it's for that reason, actually, my father, knowing that, he was in the process of donating the works to the Art Gallery of Ontario primarily, and making arrangements. But he was immersed in that world, so he knew where to go with all of the stuff, whereas many people just don't think about it, or it sort of creeps up on you, and most of us really don't want to talk about what's going to happen when we die anyway, right? So but yes, the reality is that you could end up with a capital gain, a tax, because you have more assets than you think that have been deemed disposed of upon your death. So we have another question here about addressing literary estates and the responsibilities of a literary executor, and a library containing rare books. Is it similar to a visual artist, or different?
Well, okay. I often hear people use things like literary executors is a term you often see people use. And that's often, I guess, first of all, to back up to make it really clear so people understand when they're making a will, you can have more than one executor in a will. So, I mean, you can have a will and you can have one executor, you can name more than one executor, and then you can give them different responsibilities. So you essentially say, here's the one executor that's going to manage my real estate, my financial investments, my personal belongings, et cetera, and then here is, I often use the word artistic executor when I'm drafting, and that could be someone dealing with one's literary works, it could be dealing with their visual artworks, it could be dealing with their choreographic work, it's dealing with all their intellectual property that they've created during their lifetime and that is existing at their death, and that includes so all their intellectual property and maybe all the physical assets related to that, such as their paintings, their copy, I mean their manuscripts, their everything dealing with and all their rights and their choreography, so everything that they've created that will continue, that then the artistic executor, if you're a choreographer, you want someone who's got some exposure with the dance world there, who's going to be able to know who to approach or which companies to approach, or know the people that may want to license the works to present them later on. If you're a writer, then you want someone that's, the artistic director or executor is like a literary executor, someone who knows the publishing world or has connections with that and can go out and keep the name alive. And so the rare books is really just another physical asset. So, I mean, if they're rare books, that if it's not what the artist wrote, if they're just books that they collected, I guess that's similar to a visual artist's collection of artworks. It's just another asset. It may be, and it's probably something that should be sold and maybe interesting. I mean, if you were having an estate, maybe it was a regular estate and there was like a house, some savings, rare books, and a lot of copyright into published and unpublished works. They want family member to deal with the property, deal with all of that. They want the literary executor or artistic executor to deal with, to be entrusted with all of the published and unpublished works, all the intellectual property associated with that. And maybe you would also specifically say, because these people know the literary world so much, I want them to manage the rare book collection and dispose of it, and with the belief that they might have more of an understanding of that world, because the rare book collection, that's a whole other world, and they're very valuable. And when you do these, just so I'm probably not making it very clear, but when you name these separate executors, you could name this artistic executor that is their role is to manage the physical artistic objects and the intellectual property rights, but the revenue that's derived from that, the net revenue after expenses associated with managing it and after the reasonable executor's fees, you can still direct all of that going back to your family. So I mean, it may be your family, your friends, or charitable, whoever you really want to benefit financially from it. So it's not as though if you're naming these two, if you feel like your moral or your obligation is primarily to family members, it's not, but they're not really knowledgeable or experienced in dealing with whatever area of art you've been involved with. You may appoint someone else to be the executor to manage that. That person may be in a better position to actually manage the work better, generate more revenue of it, but after they recoup their fees, that money, any net revenue gets funneled back to the family. So
right. Yeah, I also think that it's important to realize that when you're talking about book collections, rare or otherwise, that they need to be meticulously cataloged. The condition really matters a great deal. And the value that you think that some people think books have is significantly less than it actually does have. It can be extremely difficult to, or time consuming to find people who are going to be interested in things that may not actually be that rare, or maybe rare but of little interest to anybody. And so if you are looking at an estate of an individual who is a writer, who may be, quite in their 80s or whatever age, it doesn't really matter, and they say to you, oh, well, what about my books? I think it's really important to make sure that you've got a pretty meticulous catalog of exactly what we're talking about before you assume that these are necessarily of significant value. And then again, if an individual is sitting on a significant number of rare books, there does come a point when I talk to people about what they want to do, I always say, give away what you can in life. You're not going to be around to deal with this stuff. And maybe by disposing of it now, you're going to save a few gray hairs on the part of somebody else in your life. Or alternatively, maybe you can give the funds to those family members that are struggling right now for whatever reason, Like, I think that there's, I had a friend once whose parents, they had 4 kids, and the parents had decided that they were going to give the kids were all well on their way and everybody was good and everything was groovy. And they sat everybody down and said, look, when the time comes, unless something changes in the imminent near future, we plan on giving our estate to charity, because we want to do it that way. And that way there were no big surprises down the road. They were trying to really get people ready for the possibility that there was not some, you know,
They could still be
pot
a
of gold at the end
variation
of the
with
rainbow.
children. They might still
Yeah.
challenge it down the road, right? I mean, the will.
Yeah, but it's a lot harder to challenge. I don't know, sure, if you're, I can say as somebody who looked very closely at the Wills Variation Act in BC when I lived in Ontario when my dad died, I was like, geez, I wish we had a Wills Variation Act, because I can assure you that we would have taken it to court. That being said, now that I'm out here, I'm like, it's a lot harder than it looks. And it's not a litigation strat. Going into litigation is really not.
But I think there are a lot of estate litigators, so under
Yes.
will estates,
True enough.
they
True
still,
enough.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know, and they all try to get the estate to pay
settle.
legal costs and then to settle. So
Yeah.
mm,
Yeah. I mean, I personally would have.
everyone, you have to look at, but I mean, that's why. But then you get into trust planning. I mean, that's why people do alter ego trusts and move everything out to try to get themselves away from Will's variation.
Yeah. So before we go down the rabbit hole of, to litigate or not to litigate, that is the question. I think I'm going to wrap this up. We're very close to time. And I want to thank you, Dennis, for taking the time to talk a little bit about this. And also, we will have an info sheet that will circulate in the next little while. It's going to take us a week or two to get things back to people. And we will have some links to the Joe Mitchell Foundation guide, and invite you to join us again, I think, on June the 3rd. And it'll be a lunchtime event with Kickstart Disability Arts. And we're going to be talking about specific issues of interest to the disability arts community. Anybody, of course, is welcome to join us. And as always, ask questions. So without further ado, thanks again, Dennis, and everybody for joining us this evening. The sun has come out. Go out and enjoy it while you can. Bye-bye.